Good afternoon. My name is Tom Pollard. I'm Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Company of Scholars lectures from the Graduate School for this year. This is the first of 4 lectures that we're featuring this year. We've got a bit of a theme. You might have to come to all 4 lectures to figure out what the theme is. But I'll tell you about Jacob Hacker, our first speaker, in just a moment. On January 22nd, Beverly Gage from the History Department will be speaking on J. Edgar Hoover and his role in the founding of the conservative movement in the United States. On February 19th, Catherine Lothran from Religious Studies is going to be speaking about the role of religion in parenting in the U.S. She does fantastically interesting things. And then on April 2nd, Paul Tipton from the Physics Department is going to talk about whether the world's public have gotten their money's worth in the search for the Higgs boson, which is a big physics project in Switzerland he works on. Our speaker today is Jacob Hacker. Jacob received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and his PhD from Yale in the year 2000. He is now professor of political science and director of the Institute for Social and Policy Studies here at Yale. Jacob is a prolific author of works dealing with fairness in our democracy, and that's what he's going to be talking about today, I believe. He's a public figure who was prominently featured in many of the debates about the healthcare reform, and we're really thrilled to have him lead off our series this year. We intended to have this lecture at the end of October, to sort of energize everybody at the end of the political campaign. But Superstorm Sandy intervened, so we had to literally take a rain check here on the lecture. But perhaps now is even a better time for Jacob to share his thoughts on is American politics undermining the American dream. Jacob.
Thanks, Tom. Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Whenever you hear prominently featured, you should. He said I was prominently featured in the healthcare debate. You should substitute viciously attacked, but that's okay. This is why political scientists who get engaged in policy debates need to have thick skin. I want to thank Dean Pollard. I want to thank Robin Ludesser for helping put this together. And I want to mention the Institution for Social and Policy Studies really briefly, because this is a Yale institution dedicated to interdisciplinary work in the social sciences that's really focused on precisely encouraging scholars to do work that's engaged with pressing policy debates. We're doing a lot. I became director of the institution last year. We have a new graduate policy fellows program. If you're a graduate student and interested in public policy, you should look into it. We're also doing a lot of events. In fact, we're doing one tomorrow jointly with the law school on the fiscal cliff for those who are interested. I'm going to spare you what you've probably been hearing so much about and actually not talk too much about the fiscal cliff debate today, but I will say a little bit about it. So I'm going to keep my preliminary remarks relatively short because I want to be able to delve into some pretty complicated issues in about 45 minutes. And whenever I'm under these kind of time constraints, I'm reminded of an evaluation that I received when I was a new assistant professor here at Yale. And it began quite promisingly. It said, "Professor Hacker, if I had just 15 minutes to live, I'd want to spend them in your class. Because that way it would seem like an hour." Okay. Well, I do have one last thanks. I want to thank my co-author, Paul Pierson, with whom I wrote Winner Take All Politics. This is a book that has now been out for a couple of years. After a year of surfing along in the high 300,000s on Amazon, it was featured on Bill Moyer's new program on PBS. And managed to momentarily break into the top 30 on the New York Times paperback bestseller list. Thus, according to my publisher, I am now a New York Times bestselling author forevermore. So I'll take what I can get. So I have been waiting to give this talk for a long time. Hurricane Sandy, of course, intervened. I'm going to forego showing you the slide that correctly predicted every electoral college vote. because it was copied from Nate Silver's website. Okay. So enough jokes. I want to get to something that's unfortunately a lot darker, and I will motivate that focus with a report, really excellent report that came out from the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan public policy center, earlier this year. The report showed what most of you who've been paying attention to the economy and to our politics know well, that is that this has been an extremely difficult period. It's not just the Great Recession. If you look over the last 20 or 30 years, this has been a period in which middle-class wages and incomes have grown slowly. I'll show some more on that in a moment. While the economic strains facing families in many cases have increased. Most Americans feel as if inequality has risen, not surprisingly, and most who believe that it has gone up do not think it's a good thing. The pollsters are picking up this, and perhaps the most telling moment in recent debate over our governmental institution came when Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado went to the floor and presented a slide that looked something like this. This is the U.S. Congress's approval rating, sandwiched between that of Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro. I note with some mirth that Paris Hilton is substantially more popular than the contemporary Congress. But you don't have to look at these polls to sense the era of concern. This election was a nasty and difficult fight, one that perhaps provided an inspiring end for half the population, or slightly more, but which came on the heels of a very difficult period in American politics, one that shows no signs of changing soon. And I think it's worth stepping back from the debate over tax and budget policies to look at the sort of longer-term trajectory of the American dream, what I call here the American dream, which is really, by which I mean really the basic idea that in the United States, if you work hard, if you play by the rules, that you'll be able to get ahead and that your children will have a better life than you had. And this idea, which is so closely tied up with the idea of the middle class in the United States, has come under pretty significant strain. And perhaps the most notable feature of that strain has been the degree to which there seems to have been a divorce between the incomes and wealth of those at the very top and the rest of Americans. It's really striking, and I'll show some figures in a moment, just how concentrated the economic gains of the last 20 or 30 years have been. The top 0.1% of Americans, so the richest 1 in 1,000 tax-paying households, have seen their real incomes more than quadruple since the 1970s. And it's been increasingly difficult for politicians to ignore this central change. Back in 2006, Hank Paulson, then the Treasury Secretary, said, I think somewhat defensively, growing inequality is simply an economic reality, and it's neither fair nor useful to blame any political party. Now, we might understand why Paulson was dismissive. He was, of course, defending the administration he led, and there was no doubt which party he meant when he said one was being unfairly or uselessly blamed. But in fact, Paulson's view that this is simply a massive economic transformation, I think, is the common view among both popular commentators and scholars who study inequality, at least until recently. It's certainly been the view among those who've been on the winning end of these trends. Back a year earlier, before Paulson's statement in 2005, Sandy Weil said in a New York Times profile, this is the former head of Citigroup, he said, people can look at the last 25 years and say this is an incredibly unique period of time. We didn't rely on somebody else to build what we built. And in this view, the titans of finance who are surfing the waves of this new global economy are simply superstars who've benefited from an enlargement of the market, shift towards greater reliance on financial instruments, major changes in our society that have rewarded talent of the sort that Sandy Weil possesses. So it's worth knowing that before he was deposed as head of Citigroup, there was a plaque on the wall of Sandy Weil's office. It was 4 feet wide, apparently, wood, with a glass cover, and etched in that glass was a picture of Sandy Weil and his name. And below it, it said, Sandy Weil, shatterer of Glass-Steagall. Now, for those who don't get the inside reference, Glass-Steagall was, of course, the New Deal regulations whose repeal helped Citigroup form the massive banking behemoth that, in turn, helped Weil's net worth skyrocket. So politics and government were intimately involved in Sandy Weil's rise, and I'll argue are intimately involved in the rise of the very rich over the last generation more broadly. Now, this isn't a story about one party or a few bad apples at the top. It's a deeper story about how our democracy has changed. In a sense, it's a puzzle inside a riddle inside a mystery. The puzzle is why American society has become so much more unequal over the last generation, and in this specific way that I've already talked about, the concentration of rewards at the very top. The riddle is how, as we show in the book, this wasn't just a passive result of natural, inevitable market forces, though market forces played an important role, but also the result of things that our leaders did and deliberately didn't do, to redistribute income and remake markets. And that leads, of course, to the mystery, which is how did this happen, right? Our political system may not do many things well, but one thing it is supposed to do well and been set up to do well is to moderate political forces to ensure that the middle of the political spectrum and the middle class has political sway. Now, I'd like to provide the whole answer to these mysteries, riddles, and puzzles, but I'm not going to be able to. I'm going to give you a sense of some of the clues that Paul and I discuss in our book and some of the indictments that we offer. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about where I think this leaves us in the wake of a tightly fought election and against a backdrop of a looming fiscal cliff. So the way we think about inequality, I think that we are ingrained to think about inequality, is about the have-nots and the haves. Those at the bottom who are barely getting by, and the rest of Americans. The shift that I want you to make in your thinking that will really help you understand what's happened is to think instead about the have-it-alls at the top and the rest of Americans. We've transformed in the last generation into a society in which economic rewards are much, much more concentrated at the top. Now, I'm going to show you some statistics that really drive this home. They're not from my own work. They're from interpretations of Congressional Budget Office and IRS data. But I think they really make things clear. I want to warn you, since I am going to show these charts, that I have a fondness for statistics. I guess probably with this audience that's not as big of a problem as it is with some others. But my defense here came from Moyers himself, who once said that it is the mark of an educated man to be deeply moved by statistics. So, so I hope you share my passion. Okay, I'm not the only one who feels this way. Remember Occupy Wall Street? This rather short-lived but nonetheless explosive political protest featured signs like this one here. Since when have we had a political protest that used Congressional Budget Office data to make its point? And you can already see here what I'm going to show you in a moment, this remarkable rise in the incomes of the top 1%. And if you're just glancing at this, you'll notice right away that this rise, with the exception of these spikes and declines which reflect mostly the stock market, is very relatively stable over the last generation. That is, it's been a feature of our politics now for about 30 years. Let me show you this a little bit more clearly. So here I'm taking the CBO's data and going back to 1979, the first year available. And this is just on the left, the real incomes of these different income groups. So we have the lowest through the top, the fourth fifth, so that's the 60th to 80th percentile, the bottom 20%, the 60th to 80th. And then I've simply broken the top 1% out of the 80th to 90th percentiles. Since we've been talking about the bottom 99% and the top 1% a lot, This is not very strange, but I should say that at the time I was doing this, that this was actually not as commonly done in a lot of the research, and I'll show you that it matters quite a bit. So let's go back to 1979. We're looking at real dollars. These include all public and private benefits as best they can measure them, and federal taxes, though not state and local taxes. Just so you know, state and local taxes have increased a lot over the last generation, much more than federal taxes, and they're more regressive. So if anything, this would understate the changes that have taken place. So you can see if you go back to 1979, the top 1% had an average income of, in the $400,000 a year range. And that was much greater than the middle fifth over here, which had an average income that was more in the $45,000 range. But let's fast forward to 2007. Again, real dollars. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, or in this case, I guess 1.4 million words, this one is it, right? So what you can see here is really all groups have seen some gains. The gains have been most dramatic at the very top. And I'll say in a moment that this in some ways understates the transformation, since for the middle and these lower groups, a lot of these gains have been due not to rising wages, but to increased family work hours. That's not as true at the very top. So the top 1% has seen about more than a third of all income gains over this period. And really, it's even more dramatic if you look at the 2000s, when over half of all income gains went to the top 1%. But in some ways, this is actually, it's hard to believe, an understatement of how concentrated the gains are done. What if we just took this top 1%, this group, rarefied group that we talk about so much, and broke it into its various constituent parts? So we can go here from the bottom half of the top 1% all the way up to the top 0.01%. This is nosebleed territory in the income distribution. I think the technical term for this group is the ordinary rich, and the technical term for this group will say the stinking rich. Okay, so the top 0.01% to the bottom half of the top 1%. Again, 1979, you can see there is inequality among the top 1%. But what's really striking is, again, how concentrated the gains are within the top 1%. So one wonders if the slogan of Occupy Wall Street might have been, or at least maybe if the vice president start marching on Washington, we are the 99.9%. We got a little bit of a taste of this during the presidential campaign. And funnily enough, it was during the Republican primary.
Earned from bankrupting companies and laying off employees over his years of reign, that I would be glad to then listen to him.
Do you think Mitt Romney should give back what you feel are ill-gotten gains, perhaps redistribute? Welcome, comrades.
I was just struck by the Politico analysis that of the sheer volume of anti-Gingrich ads run by Romney's PAC. If his PAC millions of dollars of ads to say things that are false. That's somehow the way Washington plays the game. Isn't that exactly what's sick about this country right now? Isn't that what the American people are tired of?
Oh, it's not fair. He's using unlimited money to buy influence, rigging the system in some way. Interesting. I can't imagine how frustrated and helpless you gamers must feel. Hey, how do guys like Mitt Romney come to be anyway?
Believing at the bottom up, believing in free people and free markets.
Pull back those regulations that are strangling the American entrepreneurship.
We have to lower tax rates considerably on job creators.
Get government out of the way.
Lower taxes, less regulation, and praising the people who create jobs.
Oh, right. Your platform. Free markets, deregulation, unmitigated corporate money in politics, handsomeness, distinguished gray temples.
I spent my life in the private sector, started my own business. I've learned from that. But I learned the lessons of a free economy over 25 years. Corporations are people, my friend.
You're mad at Mitt Romney? For God's sakes, it's like Mitt Romney answered the Republicans' eHarmony ad, and now you're saying it's okay. that it's not what you meant. You don't mean it that much. Mitt Romney is the pure distillation of conservative economic policies. But now that you have to go up against them, now it's unfair. Republicans, you can't say, release the Kraken, and then when the Kraken turns on you, you're like, that's a very scary Kraken, I didn't touch. We like the ferociousness. Do we have perhaps a slightly smaller Kraken, a pocket Kraken, perhaps a crackette? Because if you know, if you don't, my friends and I are going to have to take to the streets to protest. We are the 99% of the 1%. We'll be right back.
Okay, so this debate during the Republican primaries, I think, really drove home the extent to which there was even debate about the very, very top pulling away from the rest of the rich within the top 1%. Now, I was just going to mention a couple quick things. I noted already that much of the gain in income for the middle came from increased family work hours. And you can see here that over the last 30 years or so, that really the gains in productivity, which were relatively substantial, though slower than they had been in the previous generation, were not matched by gains in compensation. Now, there's some issues with the compensation data, but this does include benefits. And you can see that it's male workers in particular, the white line here, saw really no gains. Now, and this is true actually surprisingly high up the educational spectrum. So, for example, if you look at entry-level male workers with a college degree, their income gains over the last 30 years have been relatively modest. They're less likely, for example, to have health insurance at their place of work. So these strains have been actually felt by many Americans who are actually relatively well educated. And moreover, and I think this is the important point, it's hard to reconcile those really sharp gains at the top with a model that is focused just on sort of generalized return to education, right, where you would expect that the gains would be much more broadly diffused. So in general, then, when people start to look at what's happening at the top, and I'm going to skip over a couple things that I think are of interest, but I don't want to take up too much time. In general, when you look at what's happening at the very top, you start to question the story that is emphasizing what is often called skill-biased technological change by economists. But that's a kind of negative explanation or negative account in the sense that these skill-biased technological change arguments don't seem to be wholly consistent with how concentrated the gains have been. I want to provide in a moment a much more positive account that sort of attempts to attribute many of these changes to changes in public policy. The last clue in this is that the United States is not unique, but quite distinctive in the concentration of income at the very top. So you may be aware that the economist Emmanuel Saez and his colleagues have put together the best available data, cross-national data, on the concentration of income at the top based on tax statistics. And what they've done is put these together in this source called the World Top Incomes Database. And if you take that data and you look back in the early 1970s, you can see a remarkable similarity across rich countries in the share of income going to the top 1%. I should note that these numbers do not include capital gains, which are very hard to compare across countries. That's a significant oversight, as I'll show in a moment. Capital gains are very concentrated at the top, and they're much more prevalent in the United States than in many other rich countries. So again, if anything, these numbers understate the difference between the United States and at least the non-Anglo countries. You can see here, if we go to the last year available in the top incomes database, which is not always the same, but it doesn't change the conclusion much, you can see here that the United States looks more like the so-called Anglo countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, and yet even among those countries, the gains at the very top have been much more marked. This number, including capital gains in 2007 or so, was around 25%, which was the highest point reached since on the eve of the Great Depression. You can see, though, that a number of countries have seen small increases. Some have seen almost none at all. The United States really stands out, raising the question again of why, if there's broad technological forces at work across these countries that are increasing the returns of education, the gains have been so much more concentrated in the United States than in other rich countries. Now, the first answer to this question is most of the figures I've shown you are on pre-tax data, as with this, but I did show you that figure before, the Congressional Budget Office figure that showed post-tax data. And so obviously the first question you would want to ask is, well, has government played a role in tamping down the inequalities that are occurring in pre-tax data? And the Congressional Budget Office has answered this question pretty definitively in a recent report. And you can see here that the United States, over the period of rising inequality, has actually done less to reduce the so-called Gini index through federal taxes and transfers. Whereas the Gini index reduced inequality by almost a quarter, whereas taxes and transfers reduced the Gini index by almost a quarter in 1979, the number was closer to 17%. In 2007, with most of the change occurring because of the less redistributive quality of transfers over that period. But this suggests that the United States, and if you look in comparative relief, it's distinctive, that the United States did less to reduce inequality, but it doesn't really answer the question of what happened at the very top. According to the Congressional Budget Office, about half of the rise in the Gini index in the United States is due to income gains at the top. That is, the pulling away of the top 1% and the increasing dispersion of income within that. And if we're going to try to understand the role of government in changing inequality in the United States, we're obviously going to have to look beyond just taxes and public transfers, or at least the broad effect of taxes and public transfers. So the first thing to say is that if we're looking at the top, we really need to ask what were the policies that affected the top the most? And the most obvious is tax policy. So if you go back to the 1960s here, and this is from data that comes from Saez and Piketty, you can see that income tax rates have come down very sharply at the very top. And most of that change, by the way, happens well before the Bush tax cuts of 2001. For the broad middle of the distribution, you can see there has really been no change in the average effective federal tax rate. So this is a remarkable change, and it is worth quite a bit to those at the very top. Just between the Clinton tax rates of the 1990s and 2007, the average effective income tax rate paid by the top 400 taxpayers, which is a common metric the IRS puts out, declined from around 30% to 16.5%. So when we hear talk about paying, say, Mitt Romney paying only a 14% effective tax rate, it's actually not that uncommon among the very richest taxpayers to pay something on that scale. So for the top 400 taxpayers, their average income tax rate went down from 30% to 16.5% over this period. That was worth about $46 million for every taxpayer in that top 400 group. So each taxpayer received essentially $486 million because of the decline in tax rates just since the mid-1990s. And there was just a new report out from the IRS showing that these tax rates have continued to fall, particularly as more and more of the income of those at the top is received in the form of capital gains, which is taxed at only 15% currently. So according to new IRS data, the average income tax rate for households with income above $10 million, that's about the top 0.1%, fell from 22.4% effective income tax rate to about a 20% effective income tax rate in 2010. Nonetheless, much of the change that we're talking about is before government taxes and benefits. And there's a tendency in the research to assume that that portion of the change in income must be apolitical, must have occurred without the influence of government. But if you think about it for just a moment, that's obviously a very blinkered view of the role of government. After all, governments not only tax and spend, they also regulate and shape the market in profound ways. And those ways that they do that can have an enormous effect on the distribution of income in the market, even before government's visible hand reaches in to tax or spend. I made this point. Paul and I made it in the book, and then I wrote a paper that I presented in Britain. And the young aspiring Labour Party leader, Ed Miliband, was at the conference and was taken by it and started talking about it on the campaign trail. And it so happened that not within a relatively short period of time, I found myself the subject of Question Time here we are. Did it die?
Now, normally, Mr. Speaker, at this stage in the proceedings, I say that the party opposite hasn't got any plans, but on this occasion, I can reassure the House they have got some plans. They've got a new plan. It's called pre-distribution. I think that what that means is that you spend the money before you actually get it. And I think you'll find that's why we're in the mess we're in right now.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell him what it's about. It's an economy that doesn't just work for a few at the top, but works for everyone else. And it's not about a Prime Minister who cuts taxes for millionaires while raising taxes for everyone else. And perhaps when he gets up to reply, he can answer the question which he so far hasn't answered. Is he going to be a beneficiary of the 50p tax cut?
This is an economy that's generated 1 million new private sector jobs. Now I know he doesn't want to. I know he doesn't want to talk about pre-distribution. But I've done a little work, Mr. Speaker. I can tell him about his new guru. His new guru is called, I'm not making this up, the man who invented pre-distribution. He's called, I'm not making this up, Mr. They don't want to hear.
Order, House. Order, members on both sides need to calm down. Let's hear the Prime Minister's answer.
I'm surprised they don't want to hear from their new guru. He's called Mr. J. Hacker. And Mr. J. Hacker's recommendation is that we spend an extra 200 billion and borrow an extra 200 billion in this Parliament. That is his recommendation. But in the work I've done, I've discovered his new book. It is published by Princeton University Press, and it's called The Road to Nowhere. He doesn't need to read it. He's there already.
Okay. Yes. So another deep engagement I received in the public sphere. So the idea of pre-distribution has nothing to do with either the Labour or Conservative Party's platforms. But the idea is basically that there are a lot of ways in which government can shape the distribution of market income. And in the book, we talk about several areas, from corporate governance to financial regulation to industrial relations. I think the best example is indeed financial regulation. And if we remember the story of Sandy Weill, we'll remember that deregulation was a huge part of the lead up to the financial crisis and the huge gains that happened at the top. There's still a large amount of debate about the exact role of financial deregulation in the financial crisis. But there's been a number of important pieces of work on this, including this paper by Thomas Philippon and Philip Reshef, looking at the relationship between financial deregulation and relative wages in the financial industry. Now, there are two things to note here. One is that if you see here this relative wage, which is the sort of orangish red line here, that it tracks almost perfectly the U-shaped trajectory of the top 1% over the course of the 20th century. That is, there was a large decline in the relative wage in finance after the New Deal regulations and the stock market crash, and then over the last 20 years or so, 30 years or so, with hand in hand with financial regulation, there's been an increase in the relative wage in finance. What the relative wage is basically what similarly educated and skilled workers earn in finance relative to workers in other fields. And this is just another way of saying that for a long time, people in finance didn't earn a lot of money. In the last generation, they have. Now, this is a purely correlational relationship here, but you can see here they also construct an index of financial deregulation, which tracks the rise in the financial wage premium quite closely. Another thing that seems to track what happened in deregulation is financial instability. If you look here, and this is from David Moss of the Harvard Business School, and there's a lot more going on, this is the share of income going to the top 10%. It's very similar in terms of its trajectory to the share of income going to the top 1%, or that wage premium I just showed you. And then these blue and these red lines are just various measures of financial instability, total bank failures, or the total deposits of failed and assisted institutions as a share of GDP. And it's revealing that the New Deal reforms seem to put an end to repeated endemic financial crises that had occurred prior to the Great Depression, and that it's only in the last 30 years, in line with deregulation, that we've seen more financial instability, culminating in the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. You'll see here that because of the increasing consolidation of the financial sector, that actually bank failures are not actually very high. This is a savings and loan crisis where far more banks failed, but the deposits, of course, the assets of failed institutions, of course, are enormous. And the financial story is a huge part of the story of what's happened to the top 0.1%. In fact, if you look at the tax records of this rarefied group, you'll find that about 6 in 10 are corporate or financial executives. About 2 in 10 are financial executives, about 6 in 10, 4 in 10 are corporate executives. So corporate governance is another part of the story that we tell. In each of these areas, the changes were tied up very much with the increasing role of finance, which in turn was partially a reflection of shifts in public policy. Bipartisan shifts, I should add, that I'll talk about in just a moment. Now, part of this was about changing policy, and so you saw major regulatory changes over this period. But in fact, a lot of it was simply about failing to update policy in the face of changing market structures. And that's another way in which public policy and politics can play an important role in shaping the distribution that we don't pay much attention to. In the book, we call this drift. And drift is simply when the world changes, but policy doesn't, in ways that are intended by key actors. And drift is most notable and most political in many ways when it involves the blocking activity of very powerful private actors. And this was certainly the story in finance. There's a great moment for us in the debate over accounting law changes when the head of the SEC went to the then chair of the banking committee, Phil Gramm, and asked for some updates of policy. Gramm looked at him, and I'm not going to try to do the Texas accent, and said, unless the waters are crimson with the blood of investors, I don't want you engaging in any regulatory flights of fancy. So here was a clear case in which a very powerful private actor, political actor, was standing in the way of regulatory updating. We see this again and again over this period because the industry interests were so much more energized and organized around these issues. Look at Sandy Weill putting so much more money into politics than they ever had, and were so much more capable of taking advantage of the increasing incapacity of American political institutions to act on a lot of issues. And I'm going to move now to talking about some of the larger political changes that took place. So of my three opening questions, what was the nature of the change? What were some of the policies that played a role? And why did government do it? What's the political story behind it? I want to turn to this last question before offering some broader reflections. So if the winner-take-all economy, if this rise was made substantially in Washington, that really raises a fundamental puzzle. It's again easy to see why government will often cater to large majorities that are intense in their preferences, but it's harder to think about why would you get policies over a long period of time that had such a concentrated set of beneficiaries. How could this happen in a democracy that's so often seen as so responsive to middle-class concerns? And, we can see some and I think one of the aspects of it that I think we have to understand is that it's been harder and harder, as I was just hinting, for our political institutions to act at all. And perhaps the most important reason for that is the rise of the Senate filibuster. Now, for all of those who've seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, we have this image in our mind of the filibuster as this great storied institution where senators go to the floor and debate for hours on end. At the time that this movie was made, the filibuster was actually extremely rare, and it did take this form. It was not used usually by people seeking such lofty ends as Mr. Smith was, but by Southern racists seeking to prevent civil rights legislation. But nonetheless, it was rarely used, and it was used typically by intense minorities that were willing to pay the price of going to the floor and debating for long, long periods of time. That has changed dramatically. The filibuster, and this is cloture filings to end Senate filibusters, as you can see, was relatively rare up until this period of that we've seen this last generation. And you can see that it's even concentrated within that period really over the last few years. So if you look at the 40 years before 1970, there were fewer than 40 cloture filings across that entire period. In the 40 years after, there's been more than 800 cloture filings, and in just the 4 years leading up to 2010, there were more than 200 cloture filings alone. And that's shown no sign of declining in the last 2 years, I should note, if you had any question. James Madison, we tend to think of this as an aspect of our constitutional government, but the filibuster is really an aspect of Senate rules that has no mention in the Constitution, and in fact really runs against the grain of many of the majoritarian sentiments of the founders. Here's James Madison saying that with the exception of a few areas designed to sort of create separate institutions sharing powers like the veto, having the majority be overruled by the minority violated the fundamental principle of free government. And the result of this rise in the use of the filibuster both reflects and has abetted rising partisan polarization within Congress, about which I'm sure you've heard a lot. I'll show you just one result of that. This is the number of laws passed per session of Congress. And you can see that this last Congress really stands out. In fact, I think it's the least productive Congress since the middle of the of the 19th century. Just by way of comparison, that's the do-nothing Congress that Harry Truman talked about. It passed 903 laws as compared with about 170 in the last Congress. So inaction is an important part of the story. Sorry. The other aspect of the story about which we've heard a lot lately is the transformation of the organized interest environment around government. And so it's not just that it's harder for political leaders to act, but also that they're facing much greater organized pressure on many policy issues than they were a generation ago. story we tell in our book is really of the sort of massive counter-mobilization of organized corporate interest in the 1970s around issues of regulation. There was a real backlash in the corporate community against Ralph Nader and against some of the really huge regulatory changes that were pursued under Richard Nixon, such as the EPA. And that led into a major mobilization around both lobbying and campaigns. And I mentioned lobbying first because lobbying is where corporations really put their money. The typical company spends about 10 times, that spends money on politics, spends about 10 times as much on lobbying as they do on campaigns. And they're spending a lot more than they were a generation ago. They're also spending a lot more on campaigns. We've seen that in the last election. But sometimes it's forgotten just how dramatic the shift has been. In real dollars, it's remarkable how little was being spent on elections 20 or 30 years ago. Now, in this last election, and I think in 2008, you could argue that a lot of the money was used for ends that we might support, like mobilizing voters. The point is, though, that the role of money has dramatically increased over this period, and the need to get it through various means is much greater for politicians than it has ever been. And in both those respects, I think there's an asymmetric effect on the two major political parties. And that's, I think, a hugely important aspect of the political debates today and of the debates and the policy changes that led to these shifts that I've been talking about. For the Republican Party, this dramatic transformation has been the rise of money, the rise of lobbying, the mobilization of the corporate community has been emboldening, right? It has pushed Republicans to identify more strongly with many of their core principles and policy goals, most notably tax cuts. For Democrats, the changes have been much less clear and much more cross-pressuring. Because for Democrats, they have seen simultaneously the rise in corporate lobbying and of contributions coming from the business sector, but also have been torn between that and their dwindling labor base, which has lost enormous ground over this period. And so you see this, I think, in a lot of things, but perhaps most notably, you see it in the remarkable asymmetry in the polarization of the two parties. Now, whenever we talk about polarization, I think we assume that it's symmetrical because, after all, in political science, the assumption is that the two parties are competing for the middle and that the party that deviates farthest from the center, absent a shift in where the middle is going to lose elections. But in fact, the most clear implication of much of the research that's been done by political scientists is that polarization has actually been quite dramatically asymmetrical, with Republicans moving farther to the right than Democrats have moved to the left. Now, I think that's related to the remarkable shifts in the organizational universe that I've been talking about, the decline of middle-class organizations like labor unions and cross-class civic organizations, the rise of lobbying and corporate organization. But I think it's also notable that it's probably driven also by the much different kinds of activist bases within the two parties and the better effectiveness of the Republican Party if you look at, say, Grover Norquist or the Club for Growth, at using sort of recruitment and certification processing and auditing processes to try to discipline Republican members of Congress, particularly through primaries. Whatever the exact balance of explanations, we really see it in the numbers. And these numbers come from a remarkable effort by two political scientists, Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal, to chart the ideological landscape of American politics based on members' votes. Now, I'm going to use these numbers in a somewhat, I don't know if unorthodox is the right way, but to keep with that metaphor, it's perhaps not the most kosher way to use these. I'm going to start with the levels of the average levels in the 1970s for the two parties, and then look at how the parties have evolved over the last 35 years or so. The reason why this is not entirely kosher is that there is no natural base for these numbers. It turns out that over the whole of congressional history, the mean is 0. And also, they're hard to compare over very long spans of time, although they try to anchor them with members who are overlapping in time. So let me show you the numbers, and you'll you'll see that it really doesn't matter because they could be off by a very large order of magnitude and the story would be the same. Okay, so if you look at House Democrats, they've become about 22% more liberal. Again, all the caveats. Senate Democrats have become a little bit more liberal on these DW nominate scores on the economic dimension of American politics, which is the main dimension according to Poole and Rosenthal. Senate Republicans, on the other hand, have become about 73% more conservative according to this, and it will not surprise you to see a massive increase in the conservative House Republicans. If you take these DW nominate scores and map them onto congressional history, you get a figure that looks like this. This may be the single coolest figure that I've found in American politics. It's also completely unintelligible unless I explain it. But let me just tell you that these different shades of red and blue indicate how conservative the members are. This shows you entrances of new cohorts. So here you get a class of sort of middle of the Republican road Republicans. In recent years, you can see more and more of the Republicans who've come in have been on the right side of the spectrum. This, for example, is Paul Ryan here, who's a very conservative Republican. And you can see the story is not the same on the Democratic side. That is to say, there has been much more. There have been many more centrist and sort of moderate left Democrats than there have been centrist and moderate right Republicans. You can actually get this figure, and if you're interested, I'll provide the link that goes all the way back to the founding of Congress. Few of us have any sense of what the relative influx of Whigs and Federalists means today, but for recent American politics, this picture tells us a lot. It tells us, first of all, these parties have been remarkably well balanced, and that the Republican Party has seen, since the mid-1990s, 1994 to be exact, a very large influx of very conservative Republicans. The political science Sean Theriault has calculated that almost all of the polarization of American politics, this is remarkable, is due to what he calls the Gingrich senators. That is, all the polarization of the Senate is due to what he calls the Gingrich senators, which is actually conservative House Republicans who've moved over to the Senate side. This is one reason, and then I promise I will wrap up. This is one reason why those who say gerrymandering couldn't play any role in this story might be wrong, because if the House is seating the very conservative Republicans over to the Senate, or liberal Democrats, that's one of the ways in which gerrymandering or other House-centered explanations of increased polarization might spill over onto the Senate. So this polarization raises a question of whether you see something comparable in public opinion. And I'll just say that there is very little sign of overall polarization of the public. That is, measures of dispersion do not show a big increase in polarization. On social issues, both sides of the political spectrum have actually moved substantially to the left over the last generation. On economic issues, it's a much more stable picture. But we do see, and this is what I mentioned before, there is a conservative activist base that's more intense than you see on the Democratic side of the aisle, and that may be an important part of the story. But I think it's an important part of the story that actually brings us back to the fundamental issue that I raised before. What we've seen over the last generation is a shift in policy that has actually been quite inegalitarian. Right? Inequality has gone up in the market, in part because of policy changes I've discussed. And in addition, market changes in inequality have not been matched by policy shifts that have pushed back against that rising inequality. A lot of that has been driven by inaction rather than action, and a lot of that inaction is driven by polarization and the rising increase in the use of the filibuster. And the reason that I believe that this partisan story is linked in many ways is that if you start to look at public views about inequality, about public policy, what you find is a much more complex view than you get from the kind of popular accounts of welfare states supporting Democrats on the one hand and highly conservative Republicans on the other. There was a famous article in the 1960s that argued that Americans were philosophical conservatives and operational liberals. That is, they were philosophically worried about government but loved everything that government did. And in fact, you find even among Tea Party supporters very strong support for many core public programs. At the same time, even among Democrats, you find concern that we're not addressing some of the festering fiscal problems of our country. The point is that in many ways, I think the story of the last generation is of politics has been pulled away from the middle class and driven increasingly by elite activists, the role of money in American politics, and perhaps most pervasive, the increasing incapacity of our political system to act at all. Now, this may sound like an extremely depressing story, but I don't see it as that. I think that if the depressing story in many ways is the one that we so often hear, that this is only about globalization and technological change, that our government really can do very little to deal with it. If politics is a very important part of the increasing strains facing middle-class Americans, then politics can be part of the solution as well. I do not want to pretend that addressing these problems would be easy. We're not going to revamp our Constitution, but I think we could at least have a few clear priorities that are drawn out of some of the analysis that I've offered today. First, we should be doing what we can to reduce or resist barriers to policy updating, and I think filibuster reform is an important part of that task. Second, we should be trying, insofar as possible, to reduce the ability to translate money into power. The essence of American democracy, as the two Roosevelts famously said at different points in time, is the ideal of political equality, and that rests on having some kinds of flood walls between the market and democracy. Inequality in our society is one thing. Having that inequality translate into political inequality is quite another. And finally, I think, and there's maybe a hopeful sign in this last election, that we should be striving not necessarily for a more parliamentary system, even though that's what our political structure has increasingly become, with unified parties fighting it out, but for a more majoritarian system, one in which the majority preferences on things like higher tax cuts, tax rates on the very well-off, should be able to, whenever possible, and not inconsistent with other critical rights, dominate. And when you look at the polls, what you find is that for most Americans, they do not feel that the middle class has that kind of influence. A poll that was done during the height of the fight over health care and financial reform, a time when the government was really grappling with issues of critical concern to middle-class Americans, I think drives home the sense of cynicism that many Americans feel. You can see here that when asked whether government economic policies had helped large banks and financial institutions a great deal, 53% of Americans agreed with that. But when asked if they were helping middle-class people or small businesses, only about 2% of Americans agreed a great deal. So there's a sense among many Americans that the system is not working well to represent the middle class, and I think that some of the reforms that I'm talking about might address that concern. So thank you.